In the late 19th century, a phrase echoed through the corridors of power and the streets of London with unshakable confidence. "The empire on which the sun never sets." This was not mere propaganda or poetic exaggeration. It was a statement of undeniable fact. At its zenith, the British Empire controlled approximately 23% of the world's population, governed territories spanning 35.5 million square kilometers, nearly 24% of Earth's total land area. London had become the financial capital of the world. The British pound sterling was the currency of global trade, and the Royal Navy patrolled the seas with unmatched supremacy. No nation on earth wielded more power, commanded more resources, or influenced more people than Great Britain in the early 20th century. Yet within a single generation, this seemingly invincible colossus would crumble. By the end of the Second World War, Britain would be bankrupt, exhausted, and stripped of the ability to maintain its vast empire. What had taken centuries to build would be dismantled in mere decades. How did this catastrophic reversal occur? The answer lies not in a single moment of defeat or a sudden military disaster, but rather in the very nature of colonialism itself, a system driven by relentless greed that ultimately consumed the energy and resources that sustained it. To understand how Britain fell, we must first understand how it rose. The foundations of the British Empire were not laid through grand conquests or visionary statesmanship. They were laid through something far more mundane yet far more powerful: greed. Beginning in the late 16th century, English privateers like Sir Francis Drake sailed the Spanish Main, attacking merchant vessels and plundering treasure fleets. These men were not official military forces of the crown. They were sanctioned pirates, operating with the implicit blessing of their government, enriching themselves while weakening Britain's rivals. From these humble and unsavory beginnings emerged a pattern that would define British imperialism for the next 3 centuries: the pursuit of wealth through whatever means necessary. In 1600, the East India Company was founded, and it represented something entirely new in the history of commerce and statecraft. This was not a government military expedition. This was a corporate entity, granted a charter by the Crown, with the explicit purpose of generating profits for its shareholders. The East India Company established trading posts in India, establishing themselves at coastal cities like Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. These were not, at first, imperial conquests. They were simply places where merchants could buy spices, textiles, and luxury goods at bargain prices and sell them back in Europe at enormous markups. Yet the logic of commerce demanded expansion. More goods meant more profits meant more investment and more expansion. By the mid-18th century, the East India Company had begun transforming from a trading organization into a territorial power. After the pivotal Battle of Plassey in 1757, the company effectively became the government of large portions of India, collecting taxes, maintaining armies, and administering law. The wealth flowing back to Britain was extraordinary. By the 18th century, the value of British trade with its colonies was estimated at around £12 million. By the mid-19th century, this figure had skyrocketed to £200 million. The appetite for colonial wealth had become insatiable. Yet India alone could not satisfy British greed. In the Caribbean and North America, a far more sinister source of profit emerged: slavery. The triangular trade, as historians call it, was a commercial system of breathtaking cynicism. British merchants would transport manufactured goods to West Africa, trade them for enslaved people, transport those people across the Atlantic to the Caribbean and North America, sell them to plantation owners, and then load the ships with sugar, tobacco, and rum to carry back to England. At each vertex of this triangle, fortunes were made. The profits were staggering. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Britain's Caribbean colonies, Barbados, Jamaica, Antigua, had become phenomenally wealthy through sugar production. In 1645, Barbados had around 5,700 African slaves working on its plantations. By 1698, this number had swelled to 42,000. Jamaica followed a similar trajectory, with its slave population growing from 1,410 in 1656 to over 41,000 by 1698. These islands produced extraordinary wealth. Caribbean sugar was generating some £3 million of value per year by the early 18th century. Even as the cost of that wealth was measured in the lives of approximately 200,000 African slaves brought to British territories between the 17th and 18th centuries. The moral dimensions of this commerce were not lost on contemporary observers, but they were consistently ignored by those who profited from it. As the enslaved populations vastly outnumbered the white settlers, the planter elites developed increasingly harsh legal codes to maintain control through violence and coercion. These laws defined slavery not merely as a condition of servitude, but as an inherent characteristic determined by skin color. In doing so, the British created the modern racial hierarchy that would haunt the world for centuries to come. But slavery and spice trading, however profitable, were merely the foundation. The true source of British power in the 19th century emerged from something far more transformative: industrialization. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in Britain in the late 18th century, fundamentally altered the balance of global power. Powered by coal, textile machinery, and iron production, Britain became the manufacturing center of the world. Where other nations depended on agricultural production and handicraft production, Britain increasingly produced factory-made goods in unprecedented quantities and at costs that competitors could not match. This industrial superiority translated into political and military power in a profound way. The steam-powered ships and iron-hulled vessels built by British yards gave the Royal Navy capabilities that no rival could match. Coal-powered factories produced rifles, cannons, and ammunition in quantities that dwarfed production in other nations. British industrial workers labored to produce the goods that flooded imperial markets, while the wealth generated flowed back to British investors and the British government. Yet here lay the central paradox of British imperial greed. The system required an ever-expanding market for British manufacturers and an ever-expanding source of raw materials to feed British factories. India's cotton could be cheaply purchased, spun into thread by British machines, woven into cloth in British factories, and then sold back to India at a profit, even to the same regions where the cotton had originated. African territories could be conquered to provide rubber, diamonds, and other precious resources. Australia could be established as a vast prison colony that eventually became a source of wool, metals, and agricultural products. Southeast Asia could be forced open to British trade. By the mid-19th century, Britain had systematized greed into an economic model that seemed almost infinitely expansible. The numbers tell the story. In 1850, Britain accounted for roughly 2.4% of global GDP, despite having only about 2% of the world's population. By 1913, just before the First World War, Britain still produced approximately 10% of global output, remaining the world's largest trader and its foremost financial center. The pound sterling had become the world's reserve currency. The Bank of England set the terms for global finance. London was the undisputed economic capital of the world. Yet even as Britain reached the apex of its power, the seeds of decline were being sown. The very technologies that had made Britain dominant were spreading to other nations. Germany, emerging as a unified nation-state in 1871, possessed coal reserves, iron deposits, and a population of skilled workers. Germany's industrialization proceeded at a rapid pace, and by 1900, German industrial output was approaching British levels. Similarly, the United States, itself a former British colony, was industrializing at an extraordinary rate. By 1913, America had become the world's richest nation in terms of both total and per capita output. By 1918, the United States had surpassed Britain to become the world's largest economy. Britain's response to this competitive challenge revealed both the strength and the fundamental fragility of British imperial power. The British government attempted to use military and political force to maintain its dominance. Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain made 3 diplomatic overtures to Germany between 1898 and 1901, seeking some form of understanding or alliance that might reduce pressure on the British Empire. These failed. As German naval power expanded, Britain recognized its position as the dominant naval force being challenged. The resulting arms race between Britain and Germany contributed to the tensions that would eventually explode into the First World War. Yet, competition from abroad was only part of the problem. Britain's own industrial structure was becoming brittle and outdated. Having industrialized first, Britain's industries had developed particular ways of organizing production, labor, and markets that had worked well in the 19th century but were increasingly unsuitable for 20th century competition. British factories were older than their German or American counterparts. British industrial workers, while skilled, were increasingly expensive compared to workers in newly industrializing nations. British manufacturers, comfortable with dominance, sometimes lacked the dynamism and innovation that pushed their competitors forward. Education in Britain remained limited, concentrated among a small elite educated in private schools, leaving the broader population inadequately trained for emerging technical industries. The social welfare state was underdeveloped, leaving Britain's urban poor in conditions of genuine hardship. The very wealth generated by imperial commerce had, paradoxically, reduced incentives for industrial innovation and reform. Why invest in modernizing textile factories when colonial territories could provide cheap raw materials and captive markets? Why invest in educating the working classes when imperial expansion provided an outlet for surplus population through immigration and settlement? By the early 20th century, the gap between Britain's perceived power and its actual industrial competitiveness was widening. Britain remained the center of global finance and trade, but the underlying productive capacity on which that financial dominance rested was gradually eroding. The empire that had been built on competitive industrial advantage was becoming dependent on political and military force to maintain markets and extract resources. This was a dangerous inversion of the original formula. When Britain declared war against Imperial Germany in August 1914, the nation stood at the height of its imperial power. Yet the First World War would prove to be a catastrophe that fundamentally altered Britain's position in the world. The war was an industrial war of unprecedented scale and brutality. Millions of men were conscripted or volunteered. Factories were retooled to produce weapons instead of commercial goods. Resources poured into the military machine in quantities that dwarfed anything seen in previous conflicts. Britain emerged victorious from this struggle, and at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, Britain was awarded large portions of Africa, Palestine, and Iraq. The British Empire achieved its maximum territorial extent after the First World War, theoretically controlling over 400 million people across multiple continents. Yet this expansion came at a price that was difficult to calculate at the time, but would become increasingly apparent in the years that followed. The war had cost Britain dearly in both financial and human terms. British war debt had reached astronomical levels. The government had borrowed extensively from both domestic creditors and from the United States. Britain had also suffered approximately 900,000 military deaths and another million wounded. The industrial capacity of the nation had been directed toward military production rather than commercial goods, and British markets had been lost to competitors during the war years. When the war ended, Britain faced the challenge of converting military production back to civilian goods, repaying enormous debts, managing inflation, and rebuilding an economy that had been effectively commandeered for military purposes. The 1920s saw Britain struggling with these challenges. The government attempted to return the pound sterling to the gold standard at its pre-war exchange rate, a decision that many economists, including John Maynard Keynes, argued was a mistake. The result was that British exports became expensive relative to competitors. Just as Britain faced increased competition in global markets, unemployment rose as British industry failed to regain lost markets. The social fabric of Britain was strained as veterans returned from the trenches to find economic hardship rather than the promised prosperity. The Wall Street crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression delivered another severe blow to British economic power. When the American economy collapsed, it triggered a domino effect on global trade. The economies of Europe, still recovering from the First World War, were particularly hard hit. Britain's economy, already struggling with structural problems, plunged into deep depression. By the 1930s, unemployment in Britain reached levels not seen since the 19th century. Industrial regions like Lancashire and the Midlands experienced genuine economic catastrophe. The Great Depression coincided with rising demands for independence from British colonies. In India, the Indian National Congress, led by Mohandas Gandhi, intensified its campaign for self-government. In Ireland, Britain was forced to grant independence to most of the island following a brutal civil war in the early 1920s. In other parts of the empire, rising nationalism and resentment of colonial rule began to manifest in increasingly explicit forms. The wealth that colonies were supposed to generate for the mother country was either not materializing or was increasingly insufficient to justify the costs of maintaining colonial control. When Britain declared war against Nazi Germany on September 3, 1939, the nation was already economically exhausted and militarily strained. The Second World War would prove to be the final blow to British imperial dominance. The war lasted from 1939 to 1945, and it consumed British resources on a scale that exceeded even the First World War. Britain faced not only Germany but also, for a period, stood nearly alone against the Nazi war machine after France fell in June 1940. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously secured American military aid through diplomatic persuasion, but such aid came with conditions and at a price. The United States, while nominally a neutral ally, made clear its opposition to colonialism through various diplomatic channels, most notably through the Atlantic Charter signed in August 1941. This document, created by Churchill and American President Franklin D. Roosevelt, stated that all peoples had the right to self-determination and to choose the form of government under which they lived. While intended as a statement of war aims against Nazi tyranny, the Charter's implications for the British Empire were profound and troubling to British political elites who recognized that such principles, if applied universally, would necessitate the dismantling of the empire itself. The Second World War devastated Britain financially. The government spent roughly £5 billion on the war effort, an unimaginable sum at the time, equivalent to several years of government revenue. Britain fought on credit, borrowing from the United States under a program known as Lend-Lease and accumulating vast debts that would take decades to repay. When the war ended in August 1945, Britain had technically emerged on the winning side, but the nation was bankrupt. The financial reserves that had underpinned British power for centuries had been depleted. The British currency, the pound sterling, was no longer a strong currency backed by reserves of real wealth. Britain's military had been reduced by war losses and could no longer project power as it once had. The war also had profound psychological and political effects within Britain. The British people had endured years of bombardment, rationing, and sacrifice. After the war ended, there was a widespread feeling that Britain had earned the right to focus on its own people, to rebuild its domestic economy, and to improve living standards at home. The idea of maintaining an expensive empire for the benefit of colonial elites no longer resonated with the war-exhausted British population. The first and most significant blow to British imperial authority came in 1947 when India, the prized jewel of the British Empire, was granted independence. India was not simply another colony. It was the centerpiece of the British imperial system. The wealth of India, the strategic position of India, the very concept of the British Raj had sustained British power and prestige for 2 centuries. The British Crown's conquest of India, the suppression of the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the transformation of the Indian economy to serve British interests, these had been core elements of British imperial identity. Yet by the 1940s, British rule in India had become untenable. An independence movement led by Mohandas Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru had mobilized millions of Indians through campaigns of non-violent resistance and civil disobedience. The cost of maintaining India as a colony in military forces, administrative personnel, and political capital had become prohibitive. The Indian independence movement represented not just a political challenge to British rule, but a moral challenge to the entire concept of imperialism itself. Gandhi's philosophy of non-violent resistance had proven more powerful than imperial military might. The world was watching, and public opinion, particularly in the United States and within Britain itself, was increasingly sympathetic to Indian independence. When India finally achieved independence in 1947, it was followed by partition, the division of the Indian subcontinent into India and Pakistan amid communal violence that killed between 200,000 and 1 million people, depending on the estimate. Britain lost control of territories that had generated enormous wealth, that had employed thousands of British civil servants and military officers, and that had been central to British strategic thinking for 2 centuries. The loss of India demonstrated that the empire could not be held by force, that nationalist movements backed by mass mobilization could overcome military superiority, and that the world opinion had fundamentally shifted against colonialism. If India's independence was the first great crack in the empire, the subsequent wave of African decolonization was the collapse. In the 1950s and 1960s, Britain granted independence to colony after colony in Africa. Ghana became independent in 1957, breaking the ice of African decolonization. Kenya followed in 1963 after a brutal conflict between British colonial forces and Kenyan independence fighters. Nigeria, Uganda, Tanzania, and dozens of other African territories that had been British colonies were transformed into independent nations. The process accelerated through the 1960s until, by the early 1957, Britain had relinquished control of most of its African empire. Each decolonization weakened Britain's position. Each independence movement demonstrated that the age of imperialism was ending. The costs of maintaining colonial control, military expenditures, administrative overhead, diplomatic complications had become impossible to justify. The colonies, which had been viewed as sources of wealth and strategic advantage, had become liabilities. Nationalism was rising everywhere. Colonial populations were no longer willing to accept foreign rule. International bodies like the United Nations, dominated after the war by nations hostile to colonialism, made decolonization a matter of international principle. Perhaps no single event symbolized Britain's fall from global dominance more vividly than the Suez Crisis of 1956. The Suez Canal, connecting Europe to Asia through the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, was among the most strategically important waterways in the world. When Egypt's nationalist leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, announced the nationalization of the Canal, Britain, which had long maintained control of the region and guaranteed its access to this vital artery of global commerce, decided to intervene militarily. In October 1956, British and French forces, working with Israel, attacked Egypt with the intention of overthrowing Nasser and reasserting Western control of the canal. Initial military operations appeared to be succeeding. British and French forces made progress, and it seemed possible that the intervention would achieve its objectives. Yet the international response was swift and devastating. The United States, despite its close alliance with Britain, opposed the intervention and made its opposition clear through the United Nations. The Soviet Union, then at the height of Cold War tensions with the West, seized on the opportunity to present itself as an opponent of Western imperialism and threatened military intervention on behalf of Egypt. Faced with American opposition and Soviet pressure, Britain backed down. British forces withdrew from Suez. Egypt retained control of the canal. The episode revealed that Britain could no longer act unilaterally in world affairs, that American support was not automatically available for imperial ventures, and that the era when Britain could impose its will on smaller nations had passed. The Suez Crisis was not primarily a military defeat. It was a political defeat that demonstrated to Britain and to the world that British global dominance had ended. The final chapter of the British Empire would not come until 1997, when Britain handed over Hong Kong to China on July 1. Hong Kong had been a British colony since the 19th century, the result of the Opium Wars, in which Britain had fought China to maintain the right to sell opium in Chinese territory. Hong Kong had become a symbol of British imperial power in Asia, a jewel of commerce and finance that had enriched generations of British merchants and investors. Yet, by the 1980s and 1990s, Hong Kong's future as a British colony was untenable. The colony's lease on the mainland territories was set to expire, and the Chinese government, now reformed and opening to international commerce, made clear that it intended to resume sovereignty over Hong Kong. Britain, no longer possessing the military power or the political will to maintain the colony against Chinese opposition, negotiated the handover. On a rainy night in Hong Kong in 1997, the British flag was lowered and the Chinese flag was raised. The symbolism was unmistakable. The empire on which the sun never set had finally set for good. One central question remains. Why did an empire that had conquered and controlled so much territory collapse so rapidly? The answer lies in understanding the fundamental economics of imperialism. An empire is not simply a political arrangement. It is an economic system in which a metropolitan power extracts resources and wealth from peripheral colonies. This system only works if the wealth extracted exceeds the cost of maintaining control. At the height of British dominance in the 19th century, this calculus favored the imperial power. The wealthy colonies India, Egypt, the Caribbean generated revenues and profits that far exceeded the costs of administration and military control. But by the 20th century, this balance had shifted. The costs of maintaining an empire had increased enormously. A modern industrial state requires constant investment in military capability to maintain imperial control against nationalist movements. The administrative apparatus of empire had become bloated and expensive. The infrastructure required to extract resources, ports, railways, roads, demanded continuous investment and maintenance. Meanwhile, the wealth generated by colonies had stagnated or declined. The industrial nations of Europe and America could now produce many of the resources that had once been obtained solely through colonial extraction. The monopoly on colonial trade that had enriched 19th century Britain had been eroded by the emergence of competing industrial powers. By the mid-20th century, maintaining the empire required spending far more money than it generated. The colonies, once envisioned as sources of unlimited wealth, had become financial drains. This was particularly true after the Second World War, when Britain's finances were already exhausted. A nation that could barely afford to rebuild its own infrastructure after 6 years of total war could not afford to maintain a global empire. A second crucial factor in the collapse of British dominance was the fundamental transformation of military technology and strategy. British imperial power had rested to a large extent on naval supremacy. The Royal Navy had been the instrument through which Britain maintained control of global trade routes, suppressed opposition in distant colonies, and projected power across the seas. From the 18th century through the 19th century, no other nation possessed a navy remotely capable of challenging British naval dominance. Yet by the 20th century, naval dominance no longer guaranteed global dominance. The development of air power and, later, nuclear weapons meant that control of the seas no longer guaranteed control of territories. Germany, lacking a superior navy, had nearly conquered Europe through the combined application of air power and land armies. Japan, despite lacking naval superiority in the Pacific War, had projected formidable power through air forces and land armies. By the mid-28th century, naval power, while still important, was no longer the determinative factor in global politics that it had been in the 19th century. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged after the Second World War as superpowers, not because they had the world's largest navies, but because they possessed nuclear weapons, massive land armies, and air forces of unmatched power. Britain, even with its still formidable navy, could not compete with these superpowers. The technological and strategic foundations on which British imperial power had rested had been superseded. A third and perhaps most fundamental factor in the collapse of empire was the rise of nationalist ideology and its eventual institutionalization as an international norm. Nationalism, the belief that people sharing a common culture, language, or history have the right to self-government, became the dominant political ideology of the 20th century. While nationalism had existed in earlier periods, it became universal and institutionalized after the First and especially the Second World Wars. The United Nations, created in 1945 in the aftermath of the Second World War, enshrined the principle that all nations had the right to self-determination. This was not merely an abstract principle. It was a statement of international law that effectively delegitimized the entire imperial system. A colony seeking independence could appeal to the United Nations and to international opinion for support. Britain and other imperial powers, while still possessing superior military force, found themselves increasingly isolated diplomatically and politically when they attempted to suppress independence movements. Moreover, the Cold War superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, both opposed traditional imperialism, albeit for different reasons. The United States, while certainly engaged in its own forms of economic and political dominance, presented itself as the leader of the free world, opposing both Nazi tyranny and communist oppression. The rhetoric of American power emphasized democracy and self-determination rather than colonialism. The Soviet Union, despite being an imperial power itself through its control of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, positioned itself as the opponent of Western imperialism and as the champion of liberation movements in the colonial world. This created an environment fundamentally hostile to British imperialism. Leaders of independence movements in the colonies could appeal to both superpowers for support. Britain, dependent on the United States for military and economic support, could not use military force to crush independence movements without incurring the displeasure of its closest ally. The moral legitimacy of imperialism had been destroyed by the rise of nationalist ideology and enshrined in international law and the structure of the United Nations. One of the most consequential battlegrounds for Britain's declining imperial authority was the United Nations General Assembly, where the language and votes on decolonization became a measure of Britain's waning influence and the rising power of nationalist movements. When the United Nations was founded in 1945, Britain was one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, a position that seemed to cement its status as a great power. Yet the General Assembly, where all nations, regardless of size or power, possessed 1 vote each, became an arena in which Britain's imperial pretensions were repeatedly challenged and rejected. The turning point came in the 1960s, with the adoption of General Assembly Resolution 1514, officially titled the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples. This resolution, passed by an overwhelming majority of 89 votes in favor with only 9 abstentions and no votes against, established as a matter of international law that colonialism should be brought to an end as quickly as possible. Britain abstained from voting on this resolution, unable to support a principle that directly challenged the legitimacy of maintaining colonies, yet unwilling to cast a vote against it. The passage of Resolution 1514 represented a fundamental shift in international norms. Colonialism, which had been an accepted and standard practice of international relations for centuries, was now formally delegitimized. The resolution stated that the subjection of peoples to alien domination and exploitation constituted a denial of fundamental human rights and was contrary to the UN Charter. This language, while not legally binding in the way that Security Council resolutions are binding, carried enormous moral and political weight. It established that the international community, as represented in the General Assembly, had determined that colonialism was inherently wrong. Britain's position on these decolonization votes became increasingly untenable as the decades progressed. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the General Assembly passed successive resolutions calling on specific colonial powers, most often Britain, to grant independence to named territories. Britain found itself in the awkward position of being repeatedly singled out by the international community for maintaining colonial rule. The votes were lopsided. Often, Britain would be among a small minority voting against or abstaining on resolutions calling for independence that passed with support from perhaps 100 or more nations. This voting pattern had several consequences. First, it delegitimized Britain's imperial authority in the eyes of international law and world opinion. Britain could no longer claim that maintaining colonies was a legitimate exercise of sovereignty. The international community had voted, and the verdict was unambiguous. Colonies should be granted independence. Second, it emboldened independence movements within the colonies themselves. Leaders like Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and others could point to UN resolutions supporting their cause. They could argue that the entire world, not just their own nationalist movements, supported their independence. Britain's handling of its votes on decolonization resolutions revealed the strategic dilemma facing British policymakers. Britain wanted to maintain influence in the UN as a permanent Security Council member. Yet Britain also wanted to maintain control of its colonies. These two objectives increasingly came into conflict. When Britain voted against UN resolutions calling for independence, it damaged its diplomatic standing and reinforced the image of Britain as a colonial power out of step with the modern world. When Britain abstained, it appeared weak and evasive. When Britain eventually voted in favor of independence, as it sometimes did, it appeared to be bowing to international pressure. The composition of the General Assembly itself changed over time in ways that were unfavorable to Britain. As colony after colony achieved independence and joined the United Nations, the General Assembly came to include dozens of newly independent nations that had recently broken free from British rule or other colonial powers. These newly independent nations consistently voted for resolutions supporting decolonization and independence for remaining colonies. India, a former British colony that achieved independence in 1947, became a leading voice in the General Assembly calling for the independence of other colonial territories. By the 1960s and 1970s, the anti-colonial bloc in the General Assembly represented the clear majority of the organization. Britain's ability to shape outcomes in the General Assembly declined accordingly. On matters involving decolonization, Britain was part of a shrinking minority. France, Portugal, and other colonial powers faced similar voting patterns. The combination of newly independent nations hostile to colonialism and the superpowers' own opposition to traditional imperialism meant that colonial powers found themselves isolated and outvoted on virtually every significant vote related to decolonization. Particularly damaging were the votes regarding specific territories. When Britain attempted to maintain control of territories like Rhodesia, present-day Zimbabwe, in the face of independence movements, UN votes would condemn British policy. In 1965, when the white minority government in Rhodesia unilaterally declared independence rather than accept majority rule, Britain initially attempted to resist this declaration and restore its authority. Yet as the situation became entrenched, Britain found itself condemned in the General Assembly not only for failing to grant Rhodesia independence, but for allegedly complicit with the white minority government. Britain's diplomatic position became untenable. On all sides, Britain faced criticism and condemnation. The Suez Crisis of 1956 had demonstrated Britain's inability to act unilaterally in world affairs. The UN votes on decolonization demonstrated the international community's judgment that the age of empire was finished. Britain's position on the Security Council gave it certain powers, but the General Assembly, where international opinion was expressed, had rendered a verdict against colonialism itself. Britain could not simply ignore this verdict and expect to maintain its standing as a respected member of the international community. Over time, Britain adapted to this reality, but doing so required essentially abandoning the maintenance of empire as a strategic priority. Political leaders came to recognize that attempting to hold on to colonies against international opinion, while also maintaining Britain's standing in the international community and its alliance with the United States, was impossible. The three objectives were incompatible. Britain could not do all three. The choice, made gradually and sometimes reluctantly, was to abandon the maintenance of empire in favor of maintaining Britain's position as a respected international actor. This choice was facilitated by the transformation of the Commonwealth. As Britain's colonies achieved independence, they were often invited to join the Commonwealth of Nations, a loose association of nations united by their British imperial heritage. This allowed Britain to maintain cultural, economic, and political ties with its former colonies without the costs and complications of direct colonial rule. The Commonwealth offered a way for Britain to claim continued influence over former colonies without actually governing them. It was a creative adaptation to imperial decline, allowing Britain to preserve some of the benefits of empire while avoiding the costs and diplomatic liabilities of traditional colonialism. Yet the UN votes on decolonization made clear that this transition was inevitable and that attempting to resist it would only damage Britain further. By the late 1960s and 1970s, most British political leaders had accepted that the empire was finished, even if they sometimes expressed nostalgia for its passing. The UN General Assembly had, in effect, written the obituary for the British Empire, and Britain's choice was simply how quickly and gracefully to manage its acceptance of this new reality. A final crucial factor was the shift in opinion and priorities among the British people themselves. After the Second World War, Britain was exhausted and impoverished. Soldiers returning from the war came back to a nation facing severe housing shortages, food rationing, unemployment, and economic stagnation. The British people, having sacrificed enormously for victory, turned their attention inward. The idea of maintaining an expensive empire for the benefit of distant colonial subjects held little appeal. Why should British workers toil in factories to generate wealth for colonial territories when they themselves lacked adequate housing and food? The British government, facing domestic pressure to improve living standards, found it increasingly difficult to justify the costs of maintaining empire. Political leaders, even conservative politicians like Harold Macmillan, recognized that the empire could not be held indefinitely and that Britain would be better served by managing a graceful transition to post-imperial status rather than attempting to hold on to colonies through military force and economic coercion.